Hi, this is Pro Exam. We're starting this live webinar now, and after a few hiccups in our setup, we've not got the perfect plan today, but what we're going to do is work around that. What we're looking at in this series is EU residency status post-Brexit and how Brexit affects residency for expats living and working abroad. What we're looking at today in this webinar is UK and expat travel visas in the EU Schengen Zone, particularly for family, business and property reasons. People could own an overseas property, a holiday home in the EU or the UK. They can have a business in a cross-border in another jurisdiction, or they could just have family that they want to visit. So what are the rules post-Brexit regarding residency and residency permits for people? So in this webinar, we're going to look at what is the difference between visa and a passport in terms of the EU and the context of the EU, how the Schengen Zone comes into that and the changes that are going on in Schengen Zone, and then look how an EU residency permit affects that situation for UK expats once they're living, got an EU residency permit in the UK or the EU. Post-Brexit, the EU implemented a change of law on their immigration status in July 2021. This had quite a radical effect. Now, some of the introductions and changes were already made, but they were fully enforced in July 21 and applied from August that year, post-Brexit, so that any non-EU resident who gets an EU residency permit and now is registered at a status that allows them to have freedom of movement within the EU and hence not need a Schengen Zone visa. And this is why the EU residency or the UK settled status is of relevance, and maintaining that can be of relevance. We're going to look at that in more detail in the coming weeks and months. But let's in this webinar, we're going to try and look and explore the difference, what it means by passport or visas or Schengen Zone, and how maybe just the EU and the Schengen Zone is a complication for us all. The UK is a very good passport to have. You've got 188 countries around the world with visa-free travel. So you can go on a bilateral basis in and out of that country within the rules of that agreement, often without a visa. Some countries like the USA and Canada have electronic travel authorization. The EU are introducing that. They're not calling it an ETA, they're calling it their own version of the Electronic Travel Authority, and it is linked to Schengen Zone visas. But essentially, a UK citizen or a US citizen has got visa-free movement between the USA and the UK, but you still need Electronic Travel Authority to travel. So it is a version of a visa, even though you've got this visa-free travel. And under international law, you can spend up to 180 days a resident in that other country without the need for a tax residence or possibly for a residency visa. So when you've got 90 days of freedom of movement, of free travel for a short-term family holiday, for a short-term business trip, or for a longer stay in an overseas property home if owned in Florida or France or Spain or Cyprus or Portugal. So that's what international law allows us to do. Generally, around the world, once you get beyond the 90 days, you may need to start a process of residency, but the the visa requirements vary on country by country basis. And as far as the Schengen zone goes, as far as the EU goes, once you get over that 90 days, you should be applying for a local residency permit or leaving. For the Schengen zone, at the border, whether that's an airport or whether it's a boat or whether it's a land border, they should check your movement across that border. And if you haven't got freedom of movement within the EU, within the Schengen zone, then technically you could be fined or have some other travel arrangement for that. Good morning for those that are just joining us. So you have that freedom of movement if you've got the with the EU. Now the Schengen zone, we call it the EU Schengen Zone, and it's based on the EU, and which has got 27 members, but not all the EU countries are members of Schengen Zone. But there's actually 4 countries that are not in the EU: Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, that are in the Schengen Zone. And there's 5 members, like we said in our other webinars. If you click our YouTube channel, subscribe, and you can then look in more detail at our other videos. Some other countries have applied to join: Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia, whereas Cyprus are on a longer time scale to join. But Ireland is the one outstanding EU country that hasn't applied to join the EU zone at the moment. So that you've got freedom of movement, not just within the EU. If you've got freedom of movement in the EU, it's not just the EU, but it's the whole of the Schengen zone. So it includes Switzerland, it includes Iceland, it includes Norway, and it includes Liechtenstein as well. Now, if you're a UK citizen, so if you're crossing a border as a citizen of any country, then it's down to the bilateral agreement between the 2 countries. So with a passport, anybody can cross a border depending upon the bilateral arrangements. So the UK have got 188 countries where there's visa-free travel, and other countries have got different variations, and that depends on country by country, the country of which you're a citizen and the country of which you're traveling. With the EU, that they have got 105 countries that have got visa-free travel into the EU. So there's 105 countries around the world, including the UK, Israel, USA, where their citizens can travel with a passport into an EU country without a visa. So just because you're an expat, just because you're coming from the UK, doesn't mean you need a visa to go to Spain or Cyprus or Portugal. You've got that freedom of movement to travel without a visa, without a Schengen zone visa. You travel on your passport. Okay, so that's the principle. However, as a UK citizen, if you haven't got EU residency, you're not a citizen of a member state, or you haven't got an EU residency permit, then you don't have that freedom of movement within the EU and within that Schengen zone. So it's important to bear that in mind, of that distinction that we're putting there. So the EU prized goal to have freedom of movement to live and work abroad throughout the whole of the EU, but also including the countries that are not in the EU, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. That they've got freedom of movement to live and work abroad within those countries. So what's the situation for UK expats and the Schengen zone? Before we cover that, what's the situation with the Schengen zone for people that do need a visa. If you need a visa to enter into the Schengen zone at all, that application for that visa into the Schengen zone then works throughout the whole of the EU, the Schengen zone area. Okay, so it works for all the Schengen zone countries. So if you're in a country that does not got a visa-free travel into the country within the EU that you go, yes, you could get an individual visa for that country, but under the Schengen zone rules, what you do is you get a Schengen zone visa to enter into France or Portugal or Spain, but that Schengen zone visa will then allow you to travel in the whole of the EU with that one visa. Now, that depends upon the political relationship between your home country and the country that you're going to, whether the asylum record, the immigration record, the compliance record, and obviously that's about international politics. But in principle, if you're traveling from a country where you need a visa to go to the country that you need, and you get a Schengen zone visa, not only can you travel to that one country of your destination, you can travel throughout the whole of the EU. Now, we have to bear in mind that Schengen zone visas can be issued for 1 day. They can be issued for traveling through an airport to a location for 5 days. But under the revised rules, you can get a Schengen zone visa which lasts up to 5 years. So it's a residency visa for travel, but it's not a residency visa for residency. So a Schengen zone visa will allow you to travel throughout the EU, but you're still only allowed the restricted amount of travel if you don't want to be deemed a tax resident in any particular country. But a nomad with a Schengen zone visa could travel from country to country within the Schengen zone on that visa to take their residence at 90 days without becoming a tax resident in any individual country. If you don't have a Schengen zone visa and a UK expat or an expat from around the world travels into a Schengen zone country, you're only allowed to spend 90 days in 180. So it's an added restriction with the Schengen zone that the nomad has to leave that country and can't come back within a 6-month period, and that's quite a restrictive feature of the Schengen zone in terms of that. But if you've got a Schengen zone visa, you can travel within any of the countries. So you can be a nomad on a 5-year Schengen zone visa, spending 90 days in a country without becoming a tax resident. And of course, ProAct can advise you on what would be the appropriate tax residency organisation through your personal service company or your own tax residency to minimise your tax savings. What we said before is that when you're to be tax resident somewhere, you have to have a home there. So if you're traveling abroad to work frequently, then you can't set necessarily a permanent residency base for tax residency. Therefore, it will revert to your citizenship or your domicile. So there will always be some, and there's a number of ways to manage that and to find out how to live and work remotely. Contact us at proactpartnership.com. So for EU expats moving into the UK that were resident before 2020, they qualified for pre-settled status. And once an EU expat in the UK has been there for 5 years, they can get settled status. The settled status is equivalent to a permanent residency under international law. But that settled status, it also comes with the EU rights and freedoms of movement. So you've still got that attachment to the EU and that freedom of movement, which gives you a bit more flexibility when leaving and returning to the UK. A UK expat going into the EU with a Schengen Zone visa can travel and keep moving, but you can't get the permanent residency. If you have a holiday home, or if you want to make a permanent home with a rental contract in an EU country, then the rules become slightly differently. So you can apply for a residency permit. Now, if a UK expat was living and working in the EU before Brexit completed in December 2020, then they've got the right to residency. If they've not already got the residency permit, at an individual country's discretion, they could still consider and issue it. But once you've got that residency permit under the pre-EU Brexit arrangements, that allows you that permanent residency in that country and a freedom of movement within the Schengen Zone area. So under the new regulations that came out in August 21, a UK expat with a residency permit can get an EU ID card, which allows travel across border as necessary, as they wish, within the Schengen Zone and within the EU. So you've got that freedom of movement. UK expats who relocate to the EU and get a post-Brexit residency permit. So any expat from around the world, including UK expats that are non-EU citizens, that are new expats coming to be resident in the EU, in a country like Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, and they become resident there with a residency permit. That residency permit, that EU residency permit, then gives them a freedom of movement within the whole of the EU. So yes, you've still got your freedom of movement with your passport. You have to show that at individual borders. With the EU residency permit, it gives you the freedom of movement to live and work in any particular country. A passport can give you the right to travel on a family holiday, but it doesn't give you the right to remain beyond the 6 months and become a tax resident. The EU residency permit, post-Brexit or before Brexit, allows you to become a permanent residency, stay beyond 90 days, stay beyond 180 days, become a tax resident, and live and work in that EU country. Once you've got that residency permit, you've got the freedom of movement to move within the UK. So if a UK expat takes a residency permit in Cyprus, for example, that gives freedom of movement to throughout the EU. So they could relocate and go and live and work in Portugal or Romania or Netherlands under EU rules because of their EU residency permit that they've already acquired. We're going to continue this series and look at it in a bit more detail about how the residency is impacted and what the Schengen Zone is doing, and also about how the electronic scheme works. So do subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and find out more on how people from around the world, whether it's from the UK, Asia, Africa, or America, can live and work in the EU, in Cyprus or any other country, and enjoy freedom of movement and tax efficiency when living and working abroad. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.